from University of Connecticut. So he's the director of the Humanities Institute and the director of the New England Humanities Consortium. And he authors many books, and just among the most recent ones, it's Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture, and the Internet of Us. And today he's going to be talking about social media sorry, you changed a bit the title, news sharing and bold-faced lies.
Thank you. Yes, conspiracy for purposes of time has dropped off the list. Today I'm going to talk about those topics. More broadly, the issue of information pollution, which is a concept that I find useful as an umbrella concept for the sorts of things we've been talking about at this wonderful workshop. By that, I mean simply just the dumping of toxic information into the media environment, where information can be toxic in a variety of ways. It can be toxic by being false and intentionally misleading, accidentally misleading, simply not based on any evidence at all. And those sorts of ways in which information can be toxic. And here I'm borrowing a term from my distinguished colleague, Lynn, who's been using toxicity a lot to help explain the harms of speech. The dumping of toxic information is familiar to this group, of course, through disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a variety of factors, obviously, as we all know, for trying to understand the nature of the harms and the causes of information pollution in all its forms. We need to understand, if we're going to combat it, we need to understand the nature of the digital platforms themselves. That is, the enablers of the pollution. We need to get a sense of our natural fallibility and our cognitive biases. We need to understand the social dynamics of trust, online and off. And we need to understand, of course, about the deliberate polluters, that is, troll farms, propagandists, and so on, whether those are private or state actors, et cetera, or political parties or their representatives. But today, what I want to focus on is another factor, which I think sometimes gets a little bit overlooked, and that is the fact that I think it's a fact that we often don't understand the function of certain kinds of political communication that we engage in online. We also engage in these types of political communication offline, but I'm going to be focusing on the online bit today for obvious reasons. So what I'm going to do, the idea of the talk, is I'm going to walk you through two kinds of political communication. I think that the ways in which that kind of communication functions, it makes us vulnerable, actually, to information pollution. And misunderstanding that function, that is, misunderstanding by the people who are in fact engaged in the communication itself, that misunderstanding can increases our vulnerability to the extent to which we do engage in that kind of communication. So the first kind of communication that I'm going to talk about, and one of which some of you no doubt have heard me talk about a little bit before, is sharing the news. Sharing the news. And the question I really want to ask here is, what are we doing when we share a news post online on a digital platform like Twitter or Facebook, for example? And I'll be mostly talking here about Twitter and Facebook. And again, the reasons for that are pretty obvious to this group. So by a news post here, what I mean is a post made on a digital platform that purports to be from a reliable news source. That's consistent with it actually being from a reliable news source, or from it, in fact, being from a massively unreliable news source, that is, being a piece of fake news. So that's what I mean by a news post. And the question I'm asking is, what are we doing when we, that is, people like ourselves, share such posts on digital platforms? Well, normally, I think if you ask people, and in fact, there's been studies done where people have been asked, what are you doing? The data seems to suggest, and the anecdotal data, I think from our own lives, that is reflecting on our own individual cases, if you've ever engaged in this sort of communication, we tend to think of ourselves as trying to convey information in some way or other. That is, we tend to represent ourselves to ourselves as engaging in a kind of communicative act, which has either the form of something like an assertion that is presenting a proposition as true, perhaps, for example, expressed by the headline of the post, or perhaps, and/or, because we could be doing both of these things, of course, we might take ourselves as recommending or endorsing, that is, engaging in an act that has the force of a normative prescription, such as everyone should read this. Now, obviously, we can do lots of other things when we will conceive of ourselves as doing lots of other things when sharing news posts, because human communication is complex, varied, and in many beautiful ways. But I think it's pretty obvious, both from the data and also from anecdotal reflection, that this is actually how we at least normally conceive of most of our acts of sharing news posts. And one sort of way of thinking about that is if this wasn't the normal way we thought about it, then, for example, on Twitter, people wouldn't bother to say retweets are not endorsements on their Twitter homepage. Why wouldn't they? Because obviously, if the norm was that retweets are definitely not endorsements, if that was the norm, we wouldn't bother repeating that on our homepage. So the mere fact that people go out of their way to make that point illustrates what they conceive of, at least the norm, as being. So that's what we think we're doing. But the question that I want to ask today is whether that right now is whether that is actually what we're doing. And I'm going to say that in one way it is, in one way it's not. So in order to get us to think about that, I think we need to reflect on things that we don't do, things that we do, and things that we don't do when we're sharing news posts online. So let's start with what we don't do. Well, the one thing that seems like, according to a number of studies, I'm citing here one from researchers from Columbia University in 2016, for example, is that we don't seem to read what we're sharing. I know that's a shocker to all of you, because of course I can just tell by looking at your faces that each and every one of you have always read everything that you share online, and include, of course, all the footnotes on that thing before you would even think about sharing it online. In fact, you probably take a week to reflect on it and then slowly and carefully share that piece of information online. That's how all of you folks are. But you've read about people, you've heard about people that are different from that. And what the research tends to indicate is that, for example, in one of these studies, it seems to indicate that as little as 4 in 10 people actually read what they're sharing. And by reading here, the researchers tend to mean something like click through. Now, evidence that's been shared to me by researchers at Facebook, evidence that has not been released to the public, internal evidence of Facebook indicates that actually this particular research says, oh yeah, it's way higher than that. We think it's 90%. 90% of people don't read what they're sharing, that is, click through to what they're sharing on our platform. So we don't read what we're sharing. And that seems to suggest that the idea that we're conveying information, that we're engaging in an act of conscious testimony, doesn't seem, well, it's as some of us like to say, problematized, because it doesn't seem like you're conveying information in a sort of, in a conscious way if you don't know what the information is. So what do we do? Well, as lots of you know, there's a ton of research. I just picked up a little bit of it here, that we share content that expresses strong moral emotions, for example, like outrage and anger has been talked about, and various other identity expressing values. A number of studies have indicated that tweets, for example, shares and tweets that contain strong moral language are more likely to be shared, and none of that is particularly surprising, because the social media economy rewards that which elicits strong emotions. Why does it do that? Because it wants to, the social media platforms want eyeballs on posts. And one thing we know about human beings is that our attention, that is our eyeballs, are attracted to that which elicits strong emotions, whether those emotions are positive ones that might be elicited by pictures of cats or babies, or are negative ones that might be elicited by news posts that talk about Hillary Clinton being a murderer, or et cetera, or something like that. So the hypothesis that I want to suggest to you is that what I'll call the stabilizing or primary function of sharing news posts is something that an umbrella term I'm using here, identity expression, that is not to convey information. So let me try to explain what I mean here. By identity expression, I include the expression, it's an inclusive term, meaning the expression of emotions, attitudes like arrogance, and emotional attitudes like anger, and more complicated attitudes like arrogance, and also identity reflecting values, the sorts of things that I've in other work called convictions. So, and that's consistent with the idea that some of what we're doing here is engaging in what other researchers call virtue signaling. Now, by the stabilizing or primary function of a communicative act, I mean that which explains why that kind of act continues to persist. All right, so this technical term, again, taken by from one of my colleagues, Ruth Millikan, who's been writing about this type of function for communicative acts for a long time. In her most recent work, she calls these stabilizing functions. And again, the idea is that the stabilizing function of a communicative act is that which explains why that kind of act continues to persist. That is, why it continues to be produced and why it continues to be consumed in the cognitive economy in which it is situated. So what I'm saying is that I'm saying that I'm floating the hypothesis that this identity expression is and not the conveyance of information in the sort of traditional epistemological testimony way is the primary function in that sense of, or stabilizing function of that kind of communicative act online. And that's consistent, however, and this is important for this very sophisticated audience to note that that is consistent with the following things. It's consistent with an individual communicative act being an assertion or a recommendation, and therefore being an active testimony, or as Rainey has noted, perhaps a kind of bent testimony. So the fact that it has a particular stabilizing function, that there is an explanation for why that kind of act continues to persist, could be, in fact, consistent with it being an assertion. And that's actually, I think, very important. Many of them are taking the force of an assertion or a verdict, as Alessandro Cannazzini might point out. It's also consistent with it having minimally truth act content, or consistent with a hybrid theory of content for such acts, if you're into those sorts of things. It's also consistent with the idea that such acts can and do actually convey information, that they play a role in our theoretical and practical reasoning, and that they induce belief, particularly downstream, via, for example, the inducement of emotional attitudes. Because after all, you can, it's familiar both from the human condition, that an excellent way actually to change people's belief structure is actually to first try to hook on to their emotions. Anybody who engages in advertising and marketing certainly uses that as a basic principle. So none of that, all these things are not ruled out. But it's still extremely important to focus on the fact that by misunderstanding, I think, by misunderstanding what really explains why this kind of act continues to persist. So what I'm saying is that the reason that act continues to persist is not because it's particularly useful for conveying information. It's not, I think. But it is particularly useful for building up the solidarity of the tribe and a variety of other things that identity expression, in the sense that I defined it, is useful for doing. And I think it's particularly helpful to focus on here because sharers intend to convey information. We see ourselves perhaps as playing a game of reason, when actually we're playing a very different game, a game of identity expression, a game where the rules of which are more like the rules of the water cooler or the playground than the rules of rationality. And I think that means that this lack of awareness could make people particularly vulnerable to people actors who do understand much more accurately the function of news post sharing. That is, to information polluters and their enablers. Because as any con artist can tell you, the con happens in part because the people who are being victimized think that they know what's going on, but they don't really know what's going on. They don't know the rules of the game, while the con artist does, and so can take advantage of that fact. I now want to turn to my second example of this of political communication that I think is relevant here, and I want to ask a similar question, and that's bald-faced lies. By a bald-faced lie, when I'm talking about a bald-faced lie, I'm talking about claims that involve what we might call obvious falsehoods. So an obvious falsehood is one that's really false or straightforwardly entails a proposition that is false, and which is such that there is direct and overwhelming evidence for that proposition's falsity, and that evidence is available and obvious, and it's going to turn into a lie when, for example, you utter an obvious falsehood that you don't believe. Now, you might not believe that it's false, but as long as you just don't believe it, I'm going to claim that that's sufficient for claiming that's a lie in a certain sense. And as some of us were talking about at the break, there's a literature, as many of you know, on this term, and I am mentioning some of the literature here. We have Faust, Jenny Saul, and Sorensen, and a variety of other people that have weighed in on these on bald-faced lies. I think one way to think about one example that you might think about is, suppose you're at a bus stop and it's raining. It's really raining really, really hard, and you're waiting for the bus, and there's another person next to you, and that person says to you, it's not raining. And if it was raining, I wouldn't be getting wet. Now, when those sorts of claims are made in situations like a bus stop, at first you might chuckle, you might think this person is being funny. But if they persist and they show you, so means or other, that they're quite serious, that's the moment in which you'll probably inch away and begin to hope that the bus arrives sooner rather than later. In other words, in ordinary context, bald-faced lies are just bizarre, okay? There are contexts where they arise, but in most contexts, they are treated as bizarre and uncomfortable. But now we can turn to bald-faced political lies, the sorts of lies that we might think have been more prevalent in the last few years in political discourse, not just in the United States, but across the globe. Taking any example of a political bald-faced lie in any actual real political context is fraught with danger, as many of you no doubt know, because you all work on these things. And for many of you like me who spend time talking to the public about a variety of things, you realize that taking examples in any context, like the media, is often quite difficult. Here's an example that one might take certain examples, and I'm not using the map per se, but rather things that were said about the map immediately afterwards by representatives of Trump. So by a political bald-faced lie, I mean a bald-faced lie, as I just defined it, told by a politician or their spokesperson or advocate. All right, it's generally oriented towards the or a public. So I'm interested in political bald-faced lies that meet those conditions. They're told by a politician or their advocate, and they're oriented towards the public. They're not, as it were, expressed in the elevator on the way down to the reception. So what function do these things serve? Why are they used? Why do people make such as Trump, why did he engage in these sorts of bald-faced lies? That is, lies that could be easily and quickly refuted, and in fact, could be refuted live by just simply, and in certain memorable cases that happened to him. Why would you engage in things that are so easily refuted? It seems pretty clear that it's probably not intended to deceive, at least in the sense in which typical political lying is meant to deceive. As has already been noted several times during this workshop, this sort of bald-faced lying is just, at least at the very least, even if it is intended to deceive, it's pretty rotten way of trying to deceive somebody. If you're trying to deceive somebody into thinking that it's not raining when it is raining, just standing in the rain with them while you're dripping wet and saying over and over again, it's not raining, is probably not going to do the trick, or so you might think. You might also think, well, they're not mere jokes or sarcasm. They're, often, for example, when people make these sorts of lies, their representatives later on may try, and this happened several times during the Trump administration, try to explain them away as they were joking, you know how he is, this is just the Trump being Trump, etc. But generally, claims, assertions that are made that later have to be explained as jokes were generally not intended as jokes. Something that has to be explained later as, oh, that was joking, is often not, certainly generally not very funny. And while these things can function as dog whistles, I don't think they're just dog whistles, at least not all the time. So what function do they serve? Well, at this point, I think it might be helpful to think of an analogy. And my analogy is to a football game. And I was thinking of an American football game because, American. But of course, it really doesn't matter. The sporting context doesn't matter. And you'll see that in a moment. Imagine that a player in a football game takes the ball and runs way offsides, way out of bounds, is up in the stands or something, and runs through the stands, perhaps, and runs to the other side of the field and then says, I scored a touchdown. Now, that's absurd. Of course, he didn't. He stepped out of bounds. But imagine that he continues to persist, despite the fact that there's lots of evidence being shown on slow motion on the Jumbotron. Well, in an ordinary game, this particular character would be certainly penalized, perhaps thrown out of the game, given psychological counseling. A variety of other things might happen in ordinary life. But now suppose, in my analogy, suppose that the player owns the field. Imagine that he has some power. Now, things change. Suppose further that half the fans, half the stadium is with him. They start chanting, scored a goal, despite what's happening on the Jumbotron. This puts, of course, the other players, included especially the other team, in a weird position. Because if he has enough power, he can force them to actually have to make a series of uncomfortable choices, such as perhaps just shrugging and saying, okay, well, let's continue with the game because you own the thing. Of course, if they do that, they're acquiescing to his direct flouting of the rules. On the other hand, they could, of course, throw in the towel. They could storm off the field, abdicate. Or maybe they could get in a fight. None of those options are particularly, they're not particularly attractive options. But the fact that the bald-faced lie was done by the person in power gives us a clue, I think, to its function in the political discourse. at least its function when we're talking about it as it's expressed by a politician or their advocates. And here I want to make a distinction. I want to ask now, first, what's the function of this act, this communicative act, a political bald-faced lying, when that act is engaged in by a person in with power? And then I want to ask a very different question. What is the function when it's engaged in by the people in the stands? That is, the people who are not in power. So let's take these one by one. Hypothesis. The stabilizing function of such lies from the standpoint of the politician is to express their power. Power, in particular, over what passes for truth. Again, that's consistent with there being assertions and or verdicts. In fact, I don't think you can really understand what a bald-faced lie is if you don't understand it as an assertion of some form. I think one way that this can work is, and an analogy is meant to illustrate this, is that the fact of their power allows them to can cause people, put people in a position where they have to treat the lie as if it were true, or at least as if it was not false, which of course is an important distinction. But either way, you get the idea that you get the upshot, rather, that the power of the politician or the party or the representative or the idea that's being promulgated is powerful enough to make the people act in a certain way. And getting them to act as if it was true, or at least not false, can be almost as good as getting them to believe that it's true. But now, what about those not in power who repeat such lies? What are they doing? Well, here we get to the famous two pictures that we've been talking about during this and the study by Schaffner and Lux, 2018, where they asked which American voters, self-identified Trump supporters, and those who either voted for someone else or perhaps did not vote at all. We asked which of these. We asked the authors of the study asked which of these pictures has more people in it, and a statistically significant proportion of Trump voters, that is, people who said that they had voted for Trump rather than Clinton or didn't vote at all, identified the one that clearly has less people in it as having more people. Now, as we've already talked about in this workshop, there's a variety of explanations you might give for this. The Schaffner and Lux suggest, and I agree, that it seems most likely that in this case, as Alessandra so put it in technically, that the people engaged, the Trump supporters here, may well have been engaged in some sort of identity expression, that is saying up yours, as Alessandra put it a moment ago in discussion. So it's possible that, as I said, that political bald-faced lies often function when uttered by politicians to get us to act as if the lies are true, or at least not false. And given our earlier discussions, repeating and sharing them by those not in power may serve to express and affirm a political identity, convictions and attitudes that reinforce those convictions. And of course, that in turn can be enough to cause people to turn the lie into something they're willing to act on. And indeed, perhaps farther downstream, something they're willing to believe. Because as I said already, it's perfectly consistent with the hypotheses that the claims that I'm making here, that downstream, farther downstream, people's beliefs will change. Because often acting as if something's true can, as Pascal pointed out long ago, can sort of inch you towards thinking it is true. And that's this big question that so many of us around the world are curious about, whether we're researchers, professional researchers, or ordinary people. Do we really believe these lies? And as I just said, no doubt some do. No doubt these mechanisms, these communicative acts, can contribute people believing these lies. But maybe that's the wrong question, however, and I do want to float that as something to talk about. Perhaps, I'm not saying that's not an important question. The question in political psychology of whether, for example, a political football-faced lie causes changes in belief states, either when it's uttered or perhaps farther downstream, that is much later after repetition and further engagement. That's, of course, an important question. But I'm not sure it's as important as the fact that people are acting on these lies. Because in politics, it seems to me, it's the action that matters the most. And so on that, I'll just leave with, somebody that we've referred to before in this workshop, and not surprisingly, a philosopher whose work is very much of the moment. Here's Arendt saying, before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of the man who can fabricate it. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. That was great. Super interesting and a wonderful quote to finish. So, the floor is open for discussions, and I see already questions. Jenny?
Hi, that was really great. I wanted to talk a little bit more, though, about the inference from the fact that people don't read the stories they're sharing to the claim that they therefore aren't trying to assert or share information or inform. And I would have gone along with this and nodded along, except for something that happened to me during the break, the very short break. I learned the shocking news that the Sheffield Council, that Labour had lost control in the Sheffield Council. I learned this from a Guardian headline. I didn't, in fact, have time to share that story on Facebook, because I wanted to get to the talk, but I would have shared that story on Facebook without reading it on the basis of the headline, which informed from a reliable source. I don't think the Guardian's reliable about everything, but I trust them to report the British election results. Right. And I would have been doing that. I think that would have been an assertion, and it would have been totally about informing people, not about showing. Maybe it's also about showing allegiance, but actually it's a weird one for allegiance because I'm kind of a national Labour supporter and a local Labour hater because of what Sheffield did to the trees and all this complicated stuff. So it would have been about informing. And I think given that headlines can be informative, if you have a reliable source and an informative headline, I think the fact that the story doesn't get read doesn't necessarily show it's not informing.
Well, I agree. And as I said, I think that was the bit of the slide where I was saying, well, this hypothesis is also consistent with all these things, including it's consistent with the fact that the force of the communicative act can be actually the force of an assertion. And in fact, it can be used to convey information. The point that I'm trying to get at here, and this is why I find Jenny's work, Ruth's work so helpful here, is that the idea of talking about the stabilizing function is the thought that let's talk about why this kind of act persists as much as it does, right, in the cognitive economy of consumers and producers in which it's in. And she, of course, applies that to communicative acts, linguistic acts across the board. I'm not doing that, but although I think that's a fascinating program. So the salient thing here is that, what she's saying is, well, that's distinct from asking what the people's intentions are when they're actually, what they're intending to do. It's also, in fact, distinct from what any particular causal downstream effect of an individual token of that type of act might have in a particular case. So what that allows me to do is to say, right, we can ask, why this news sharing happens in the ways that it does. And what I'm saying is, given the data, the best explanation of that is not that the majority of people, of users, are using this to convey information in the detailed way they represent themselves to themselves as doing. But that's completely consistent with the fact that many of us do actually accidentally or intentionally convey information with those acts. And it's also consistent with the fact that, in certain cases, just like the one you mentioned, sharing something that, in moments. So one thing that people will bring up when I give this sort of talk is they'll say, well, in moments of like natural disasters and so forth, people share information very quickly, right? That they don't, like the earthquake is happening, right? And they don't read the story because the information they're trying to convey, and they are trying to convey, is just a simple fact expressed by the headline, just as in your case. And I want to grant that that's all the case. I'm just not, when we're talking about the kind of act and its persistence in the way that it persists in the economy as it is, I don't think that's going to be the that's going to be the most plausible explanation.
Yeah, I think I'm broadly in agreement about what these acts are about, but I do think that people put way too much weight on the fact that people share without reading. I think that doesn't necessarily mean what people are taking it to mean. So it's just that particular inference that I think there's other evidence that supports this, but I think that bit of evidence isn't so good.
Fair enough. I mean, as I mentioned, I think I agree that there's a lot of other evidence that supports that. Yeah. And I agree that evidence is, it requires me to make these distinctions that I just made. Yeah. So machinery is being trotted out, obviously. So you're right to flag that. Thank you.
Right, next question is from Kaylin.
Hey, so first of all, thank you for this talk. I mean, this was such an interesting analysis. This question builds off Jenny's question a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it had seemed to me like there are a number of instances, both of social sharing online and of bald-faced lies, where I would think, well, some instances aren't like other ones, and maybe their sustaining functions aren't the same sustaining functions. So for example, with like social sharing of information, especially, you're focusing on articles that people just kind of share without clicking through.
Right.
I had been thinking of cases just like this. I'm trying to share brand new information. And I do think that's like a social act, because I get like appreciation and people think I'm up to the minute or clever if I share really new information quickly. But then the goal is to be sharing information and informing other people about that. And, if it wasn't doing that, it wouldn't be playing the sort of relevant social function. So yeah, that was just an example to me that seemed like, okay, but in that case, maybe the function isn't identity expression so much as something else. And maybe there's different kinds of cases in there. And then regarding bald-faced lies, it seems to me like, well, there are, I think your analysis is really good. And there seem to be so many cases that fall really well under that. But then I was thinking of others like, Obama isn't born in the US, where when that was first being propagated, it wasn't by like the owners of the football field necessarily. And it did seem to me like the function was probably to deceive, and that it was quite effective at deceiving. It's not like the rain example where you can just look out and see the rain. You can't watch, Obama's mom give birth to him. And so, I wondered what you thought about that, about like the heterogeneity of these different sorts of examples.
Great, both really good examples. So let me start with the last one about bald-faced lies. So, I think it's important for me to flag more than I did, perhaps, that if I had longer, I would have, but these, the bald-faced lies that I was particularly puzzled by, that I was talking about here, were ones that fit that sort of that definition that I gave. And something like, Obama was not born in the U.S. doesn't actually, it's a lie. It's obvious, we might say in some sense it's an obvious lie, but it doesn't fit that definition. The types of examples that I was thinking of were examples like, for example, when a politician says, I didn't say that. And then at the same time that they're saying I didn't say that, there's a clip of them on the television immediately saying that. And the reporter saying, yes, I was there and he actually said that. Or somebody who, for example, and again, any of these examples could be debated because I use certain, I talked about the directness of the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. So without maybe I could spin out certain other examples. I used the one about the map. I could give you the assertion I was interested in there. But what I was interested in is cases in which one didn't even have to actually trust expert authority, or at least not to a very great extent. One could, as it were, just see that the lie was false, that the lie was a lie, or that one, didn't have to do at least very much research, that is, even very much Googling to see that it was false. So I think I was just puzzled with those cases, which you might say, well, there's not really that many of them. And I would say, yeah, that's right. It's the fact that there have been any of them recently is sort of striking, given the bizarreness of the act. So that's the first thing I would say about that. So I completely agree that lies uttered by politicians, including ones that are sort of hilariously false, don't all fit the analysis that I'm giving, but that's intentional. Because I think lying by politicians is an extremely diverse phenomenon that no one analysis could ever capture. Okay, now about the point about news post sharing. Yep, I mean, I think what you and Jenny are both pointing out is that, look, here too, we're going to have a variety of acts. And, in one sense, I want to say, well, maybe I just say, yeah, okay, that seems right. It does seem that, and in a way, that should surprise none of us, right? That online communication is as varied and complicated as communication is in general. And so it's very difficult to, to just pick out, it's as if, saying, well, why is it that people make assertions? Well, you could say to convey information, but actually, depending on the type of assertion, the type of context, there's all sorts of more complicated things to say about that. So I take your point. I will say, though, that I think that even in the example that you gave, I'm not convinced that there isn't some identity and social identity expression going on. And the question really will be, for my analysis, how many kinds of acts can I explain by appealing to this notion of the stabilizing function and identifying the stabilizing function for what it is? What I'm maintaining is that the reason that these kind of acts, online news post sharing, generally persist, what causes them, this kind of act, to be as common as it is the kind of act, as common as it is its social role in social identity expression. That's, again, just to repeat myself, completely consistent with the fact that in sub-communities or within particular individuals, and certainly particular tokens of that type of actor, instances of the kind, there's all sorts of other things going on, some of which are straight up conveying of information that the person is well aware of. Because after all, when I give this talk in public settings, I always get some person who says, but I read everything I share, and I'm sure that they do. But that fact, I think, doesn't sort of push up against the analysis itself. That was a long-winded answer, but super interesting question.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I certainly really appreciate what you're doing, because anything that pushes on some super simple analysis, like we're just engaging in information sharing or testimony, I mean, that seems wrong. And so complicating and looking at like the different things that are going on with information sharing online seems, yeah, great.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think we have Kasim, Alexandra, then, and I'm not sure, Cynthia, when you put your hand up, I can't keep track of, but we have plenty of time. So Kasim.
Hi, Michael. That was great. I agreed with all of that. I just wanted to maybe introduce another dimension into the analysis. So during the Brexit debate in the UK, there was a slogan that was used, which was something like, "We send £350 million a week to the EU let's spend it on our NHS instead. So
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
politically potent and effective slogan. Now, you can have an argument about whether that was a bald-faced lie, the figure was a bald-faced lie, or whether it was simply kind of misleading. It was misleading because it was a gross figure and not the net figure, which is about half, something like that. Now, the guy who came up with that slogan, a political operator called Dominic Cummings, actually wrote about about the rationale for that slogan. And what he said was that, of course, we knew perfectly well that calculating the actual UK contribution to the EU is a very complicated matter. We knew that perfectly well. But what we were trying to do was to provoke a discussion of this issue, to focus attention on this issue. So even if, you know, somebody says, well, no, actually, it's only 175 million pounds, that still, to most people, sounds like a lot of money. So the function there is sort of shift provocation with the object of focusing attention on something. So similarly with, you know, immigration figures or crime rates, you can put a misleading or false figure out there with the aim of getting people to discuss what the actual figure is, and thereby focusing attention on things. So my question is this: so you've got identity expression, and you've got expression of power, and what we have in these cases is well, you know, provocation or something like that, strategic provocation, and I was just wondering where that would fit into your analysis.
That's helpful. Thank you. I think that usually when people are using certainly you're right that's absolutely a way in which lies can be used by people in power to change the conversation or to focus the conversation or to attract attention. You know, often just simply attracting attention, period, not even to an issue, is part of where a lie might come into being. So, you know, in all those cases, it's not really deception that people are after per se, although if that happens, good, that's good too, right? So, but this other sort of end. I think, so I want to just grant that that's possible. And I think that in a way that can be folded into the way in which the expression of power by some, you know, to deny reality and have the power to deny reality. That's one of the mechanisms by which people can begin to at least get people to at least not think that thing's false. That is to, you know, pay attention to it, right? As I said, part of the function is to get the public to perhaps act as if it's true, or at least act as if it's not false, so that it's open for discussion, right? That it's just one of those things that we can talk about now. Maybe the number's 350, maybe it's 250, it's a big number, you know, that's at least we got that across, right? So I think that is in line with the type of thing that I'm talking about. I mean, I think it's clear, you know, that to me, and I think probably clear to all of you, that there's a lot more work to be done here in the details, a lot of, you know, the mechanisms of how you go from, you know, how this power is used and how it gets people to engage in actions that fall under the heading acting as if it's true or at least not false. And the ways in which people can act in those ways, of course, are varied. So I absolutely take the point. I think it's you know, I'll have to think about it more.
Yeah, just one kind of observation about that. I mean, the one issue with folding it into the expression of power thing is that in the case of that slogan, I mean, it was on behalf of a campaign that appeared to be losing, campaign to leave the EU at the time that the slogan, and it was right. It was not the government's view. The government wanted the UK to remain, as right. did the Labour opposition. Right. So this was a kind of renegade movement. Which was using this to focus discussion on an issue that it was exercised by. So that would be one hesitation I would have about trying to fold this into the expression of power dimension of your account, rather than treating it as a kind of just a different thing, a different stabilizing function.
No, I see now. I see the point. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. So Yeah, I mean, one way I could push back on that is to say, well, let's talk about the different ways in which power is manifested in political society, and it's not always manifested from the government. Power is inherent in social structures of all kinds, and the limits of those power and the extent of that power, of course, is different depending on the structure in question. Parties have power. They have power over the people who are members of the party, or people or that they wish to be members of the party, or with people that they wish to at least, attract attention. So there is that, but so I think I could say that, and I guess I just said it, but I also would, I take your point, just as I was taking the point with Jenny's point earlier and Caitlin's way of following up on that. I mean, there's going to be a variety of phenomena here, and I am no interest, as a pluralist generally about like everything. I'm just not in the business of trying to give a reductive analysis here. What I'm trying to do is say, here is a really bizarre phenomenon, and it's got to have there's got to be some sort of explanation of why it is persisting at this moment in time. And it could turn out that there may turn out to be several different explanations, because once we get fine-grained enough with the examples, right, we're going to find, like we so often do in communication and human life, the explanations are going to have to be modified to fit the particular facts on the ground.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So we have Alexandra and then Cynthia.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. So I have a comment and a question. The first comment is that I was inclined to go the other way from Jenny. She said you shouldn't infer from the fact that people don't read it that they are not, conveying information, that their main aim is to convey information. Seems to me that it's perfectly possible for somebody to read it and still engage in identity expressive cognition, right? So I think the reading or not reading, I think is not closely connected to what the main point of the communication is. But then I would like to push you on your idea that basically if it is engaged in the game of identity expression, then it's not in the game of reasons. And I think you say that because you're taking identity expression to be identity protective cognition. Correct. Which is the idea that your cognition is a form of defensive mechanism in protection. But presumably whether identity expressive cognition is like that depends on what kind of identity you're being expressing, right? So it seems to me that there are, I know psychologists don't talk in these terms because they are interested in a specific kind of identity expressive cognition, one that is basically concerned with fighting your corner, fighting for your social identity. But I see no reason in principle why there can't be identities that are of a different sort. I don't know, like a vegan identity, right? Mm-hmm. You could engage in identity expressive cognition where you do so by expressing the values and the convictions of being a vegan, which need not be opposed to the game of reasons. So it seems to me that you could say that something is both there for the purpose of expressing identities, but that some identities are better than others.
Yeah. Or some forms of identity expression are more connected to rationality than others, even if they're, so that's a really interesting observation. It seems like it maybe almost has to be right because of the following example. It's part of I think many of us here, I suspect, it's part of our identity. That is the kind of person that we aspire to be. That's what I mean by identity in this context. That we are the sort of people that give and ask for reasons, right? Rational. Playing the game of reason is part of our identity. So we could express that identity, right, to each other in all sorts of ways. by wearing a T-shirt, for example, from, I could be wearing a T-shirt from the Yukon Logic Group, and that would be an expressive of that kind of identity. So that's to your point. So I'm just making the problem worse for myself by putting the example, making it, So, I guess what I would say about that is, maybe the question we need to think about then is what sorts of identities are people, or what sorts of identity people are often, statistically most often sharing when they share political news stories, right? And again, the sorts of stories that I'm thinking about were mostly, I didn't say that, but mostly political news stories. And when we're talking about political news stories, I am not as convinced that the types of identities we're most actively seeking to express are ones that might fall under the rubric that we were just talking about. But Alessandra, I'll have to think about that more too. This is connected. I'm working on a book right now on the nature of political truth in general. And one of the things I am struggling with right now is the extent to which politics obviously is an expressive enterprise, but also, at least under one vision of politics, as perhaps naive as it might be, that politics can also be a rational enterprise, and how to put those two things together. So I will be working on it. Sorry for I don't have a better answer for
Could
you.
I make a comment? Would that
Yes.
be okay, Michael? But it seems to me that, for instance, if you take the beautiful example of Jenny, and by the way, the Tories have taken also a sort of a constituency in a place in the Senate in South Wales that is just ridiculous how everybody. But anyway, so we are following the elections, of course, because the results are coming out as this. But that example, right? I think it's a wonderful example where something can be both identity and expressive and conveying information.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see. Yeah.
If you think of testimony normally, you don't just go around telling people stuff that they already know. You have no reason to believe that they don't already know, right? You're providing information to people because you sense that they have a need for information. Very rarely we share information on Facebook because we think that people on our feed don't know it, right? And so it seems to be that you're both conveying the information, but you're also doing something else, which could be identity expression, but it could be in the game of reason, and it could be political. So
yeah. So yeah, I guess I would agree that can certainly be the case. But as you just pointed out, most of the time, I think people who engage in sharing information, even if it is what they actually end up doing online, are sharing information, political information online that they think actually they have excellent reasons to think, if they stop to think about it, which they probably won't, that their cohort actually already knows. So in this particular case, the example you gave, no. You're trying to get the word out. It's like my example of the natural disaster, where you're tweeting out that you're safe, for example, to people, or tweeting out a news story to somebody to indicate that, yep, it's really happening right now. You better check in with that loved one. That's a different sort of example, and it's a different sort of case. But it doesn't. That particular case doesn't persuade me to think that, to change my mind on this, what the stabilizing function is, even if, again, we have to ask what the stabilizing function of these acts are, is what I'm asking us to think about. But to reiterate my earlier concession, I also agree that there are different kinds of acts that people are engaging in here. So it's complicated, clearly much more work to be done. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, so we have a final question from Cynthia, and we are almost in the break, but we can continue the conversation. So please.
I'll keep my answer short.
Okay, I'll try to make my question short. So I just had a case I wanted to ask you about. So I was, this was on Fox News about a week ago. The newscaster referred to Joe Biden's lie that systemic racism exists in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And which kind of triggered me, right? Because obviously he believes it to be true, so it cannot be a lie, right? But then I started thinking, what was the purpose of her conflating this sort of idea that he's saying something she takes to be false with the idea that he's lying? And so she was actually trying to convert something into a bald-faced lie in this case, right? Because she thinks it's obviously false that there's systemic racism. And so that I just wondered if you had anything to say about the function of that instance of trying to convert something into a bald-faced lie that it's not only not a lie, but is not false also. But
right, no, right, exactly. Yeah, no, great question. And yeah, because, you know, luckily for me, I'm almost out of time because I don't have anything particularly illuminating to say about that, other than that's a great puzzle. I think something we should be thinking about. How do we think about the rhetoric because that happens all the time, where people try to convert, you know, the term lie has become, you know, it's become sort of unleashed in the American political discourse. For a long time, the New York Times, for example, wouldn't call even obvious falsehoods uttered by politicians lies. That's changed now. There's been a real, you know, normative shift in the media. And that has also meant that there's been an uptick, I believe, I agree with you, notice the same phenomenon of people trying to convert things into lie talk. Because lie talk has powerful moral relevance and salience to people. It's part of why people lobby the New York Times to change their norms, right? Because of the moral salience. Kasim, for example, gave a wonderful talk about this in London a couple of years ago, where he pointed out himself that, you know, that we really need to stop calling certain things bullshit and call them lies. So I think something that's part of the function here is to raise the moral salience of the that's my best guess. And there's no doubt other things to say about that. I mean, there's other weird things to say about the use of the word. I mean, a lot of folks in ordinary discourse tend to conflate falsehoods, making a mistake even. Like sometimes people will say, somebody will utter a mistake, just make a claim they think is true, but it's false. And people will say, well, you lied about that. And that's clearly not how we, you know, maybe in moments of reflection, we think the term should be used, but it is used that way. So, you know, I mean, I've even heard, you know, you can hear actors being interviewed and that they'll talk about their profession as engaged in professional lying. Well, not in the way I think about lying, but again, so the term itself, of course, is like all interesting terms, slippery. And that, of course, gives lots of room in political discourse for people to leverage the term one way or the other to take advantage of that moral resonance. Sorry, I couldn't be more helpful.
That was really helpful. No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank
for
you.
Fascinating story, a lively discussion. So